Misha Glenny is an award-winning journalist and author. Hello, Misha.
Hello, nice to be here, Peter.
You specialize in Southeast Europe, but I remember you as a Central European correspondent of the BBC in Prague in the 80s. And I remember that I read about you in an article of then illegal Lidové noviny, because you had a problem at one of the demonstrations. What was it?
That was on the 1st of May, 1. Maje, 1989. And everyone was up there on the podium. Jakeš was there, Straugal was there, Bilak was there, all the old team. And Václavské náměstí was full of people, obviously. But there were groups of them who started chanting anti-government demonstrations. Svoboda, svoboda, demokracie, i tak dál, those sorts of things. And I was recording them with my big, heavy BBC radio recorder and interviewing them. And suddenly I was lifted up. It was like being on a helicopter, or a giant octopus had taken me. And there were about 8 people, 8 big estebazzi, took me off. It was just by the Yalta Hotel. I don't know if the Yalta still exists, but it was...
The building does.
The building does. And just near the Yalta, there's a little passageway. They took me in, they punched me and tried to damage my recording equipment. And I remember the guy's face, the main guy who was interrogating me. And I had my prukaz, my novinářský prukaz, so I could show him that. But they took me off to Školská ulice, where there were about 200, 250 other people who had been arrested. We were all made to sit on the ground. And the only thing I remember is Stanislav Devati was there. That was the first time I met Devati. And in the meanwhile, somebody had ran the story. It was a Reuters journalist, and the British embassy was alerted, and it became a diplomatic incident. But for me, it was just very interesting to see how the STB really operated when they were under pressure. And that guy who interrogated me, his face was so memorable. During November, during the November the 17th, I saw him again, and he was encouraging the student demonstration. He was up to no good. What exactly he was doing, I didn't know, but I never forgot that face.
When we look back, many things changed profoundly in Europe since 1980s. Did anything in Europe remain the same until this very day? Or is Europe a different continent?
No, Europe is a different continent. When 1989 happens, it has to become a different continent. The European Union expanded. The European Union has become much more powerful in terms of its economy. It doesn't know how to use that power. It doesn't have the structures to use that power. And we have seen various political forces seeing the European Union as a threat. They exist here in Czechia. They exist in Slovakia.
And in Britain.
And in Britain. So there's one good aspect to Brexit. There are virtually no good aspects to Brexit, but there's one good aspect, and that is that everybody else who was thinking about leaving the European Union suddenly said, God, this is such a disaster. Actually, maybe we don't want to leave the European Union, because the impact on the British economy has been enormous, estimated at around 4% of GDP. We are poorer. We have virtually zero influence in the world, except perhaps in the defense and security sector. But politically, we have been hugely, hugely damaged. So we're now in this period of tremendous uncertainty, and it doesn't matter which country in the European Union you're in, you feel that sense of uncertainty that we don't really know where everything is going, and we don't have so much control over our fate.
In the language of the news, we very often say Europe, and what we mean is the European Union, or the other way around.
Very true.
Do you mind if we, or when we, identify Europe with the 27 countries of the Union?
Well, I try and call it the European Union when I'm talking about the European Union.
I'm not accusing you.
No. No, I realise that, but I'm just... So it's important because culturally, of course, for me, Britain is part of Europe. Culturally, for me, Serbia is part of Europe. Albania is part of Europe. They're not yet members of the European Union. I very much hope they will become members of the European Union. But the cultural connections are so deep, even between the United Kingdom and the rest of Europe. Now, if you're in the UK, you have that sense of being an island, and you also have a cultural link with the United States because of the language and the history, which not all European Union countries have. But if you look at the 19th century, the 18th and 19th century, the connections between Britain and Germany in particular were incredibly deep and strong, particularly in matters such as industry, science, whether it's chemistry, physics, but also philosophy and culture. There was this tremendous connection which was broken to a large extent by the First and Second World Wars. So culturally, I see Britain very much as part of this of the European Union as well, even though it's no longer a member.
Let's go back to the continent proper. You specialize in Southeast Europe.
Yeah.
Is Southeast Europe very different from the rest of Europe nowadays?
Well, it's poorer than the rest of Europe. It doesn't have as much money, and it still has the historical legacy of being at a strategic crossroads in Europe. So the reason why there is so much tension and violence at certain points in southeastern Europe is because it is where three empires and three different religions, i.e. Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Pravoslavství, and Islam met. And in the 19th and 20th century, they were always fighting for control over the Balkans, partly for cultural reasons, but above all else for strategic reasons, because it was what separated the oil of the Middle East from the markets in Europe. And so you have to understand Southeastern Europe in that historical context to understand the occasional outbreaks of violence, just as you have to understand East Central Europe, Poland, Belarus, Lithuania, Ukraine, in that same context of what Timothy Snyder, the historian, called the Bloodlands.
Yes.
These are contested areas. And when you have contested areas like that, the local population suffers.
You mentioned Serbia, and you also said that you believe Serbia and other Balkan countries join the European Union. On the other hand, if we take just Serbia, the support, the popular support of joining the EU dropped.
Yes, it did drop.
And it's not just this reason why some analysts are quite skeptical about Serbia's European membership.
Let me put that in a certain context. And again, very briefly, I want to talk about Serbian history. If I read one more time in The Guardian or the New York Times that Serbia's traditional close ally, Russia, said this or did that, I will tear my hair out, because in the 19th and 20th century, Serbia's allies were either Austria or Germany or Britain or France. One ally Serbia never had was Russia. And indeed, Russia inflicted considerable distress upon Serbia in the shape of the Soviet Union at the end of the Second World War, which is why there was the break between Tito and Stalin, which was very important. So Serbia has, particularly in its urban centers of Novi Sad, Belgrade and Niš, a very strong pro-European Union majority. It's true that recently, in the past 3 years, 4 years or so, that support has dropped. And it's true that Alexander Vučić, the president, has encouraged, in part, a pro-Russian right-wing resurgence within his own party. However, 60% of Serbia's trade is with the European Union. The big investors in Serbia are the United States and the European Union. The only other big investor or strategic investor is China, which is important. Russia invests nothing in Serbia. And so that picture, and we've seen in the past 6 months, this extraordinary uprising against Vučić, quite incredible across the country, not just students, but farmers, workers, soldiers, lawyers, professors. That goes to show you that there is a really positive, progressive, and indeed pro-European aspect to Serbia, which we should not underestimate.
I'm no match for you in the questions of Serbian history, but still, I remember that very recently there were signs of close ties among Moscow and Belgrade. Let's take COVID, for example, the epidemic. At that time, the Serbians flirted with the idea of a Russian vaccine, something Europeans tried to avoid at all costs.
And this was partly because...
Vučić is, even in the times of Ukrainian conflict, much more lenient towards Putin than, say, Friedrich Merz.
Right. So here's something which I have to push back on. Who is the second biggest supplier of ammunition to Ukraine of 155mm shells? The answer is Serbia. It has sold 1 billion shells to Ukraine, $1 billion worth of shells to Ukraine in the past 2 years. Vučić actually has a good relationship with Zelensky. Vučić personally doesn't like Putin, but he is playing both sides. He's hedging. But in terms of actual practical support for Ukraine, Serbia has done more than almost anyone else apart from Germany, Britain and the United States, because of the fact that it produces the right type of shells and it sells them to them, even though Russia has tried to stop Serbia from doing this. Serbia has been doing this in collaboration with the United States under Biden. So on that one, I think there's concrete evidence to suggest that the perception is rather different from the reality.
Let me jump a little, but stay in Belgrade. Do you know the project of the hotel Donald Trump is planning to build in the city? Do you like it?
No, I don't. I'm not sure that it will be built. I'm also very skeptical about Albania building a similar project on Sazan Island in Albania. Trump is obviously transactional. Vučić is trying to curry favor with Trump, although recently, very interestingly, he went just before the May celebrations or commemorations in Moscow, which Vučić attended. He went to Florida, to Mar-a-Lago, expecting a meeting with Trump, and Trump refused to see him, snubbed him. And so Vučić came back with his tail between his legs. And then he went to Moscow, and he was put in the fourth row, which is where the sort of pets and family members usually go. So he's not seen as that relationship between Moscow is much more complicated than it looks. Putin does have his people in Belgrade, there's no question, and Alexander Vulin, the former head of the intelligence services, is one of those. But at the request of the United States before Trump, Vulin was pushed out of that position precisely because of his relationship with Russia. So there's a game going on in Belgrade. There's no question about it. But I think that it is important that the European Union continue to have a dialogue with Belgrade. I'm not sure that Vučić will last very long. And then the European Union needs to be ready. If the EU wants to play a strategic game against China and the United States and Russia, it has to start acting like a grown-up.
Which other Balkan countries are top contenders for the European membership, in your view? We mentioned Serbia, but how about Bosnia?
So in the first instance, Montenegro and Albania. So there is discussions going on about, can we get Montenegro in as a signal to the rest of the countries, because Montenegro only has a population of 850,000. And so people won't notice it if it comes in. And Albania has been working very hard under its Prime Minister, Edi Rama, who just won a fourth term with a crushing victory, to try and have its membership approved. This will be, in the next 2 to 3 years, this will be a litmus test for the European Union to see whether it is thinking strategically or not. Bosnia-Herzegovina, unfortunately, has an unworkable political system, an unworkable constitution, and both Belgrade and Zagreb interfere, although I have to stress again, the relationship between Vučić and Milorad Dodik, who really is Moscow's man, who runs the Serbian part of Bosnia-Herzegovina, that is not a great relationship. And what Dodik is always after is money. He needs money the whole time. So that's why every time he goes to Moscow, you know that Dodik is probably asking for another $1 billion. And he does the same with China as well. So Bosnia is probably the furthest away. And Serbia and Kosovo, of course, have to have a resolution of their dispute before they're allowed in. Macedonia used to be at the front, North Macedonia, used to be at the front of the queue. It's now sort of halfway down, and I'm not confident about North Macedonia at the moment. That's largely because of the Bulgarians playing silly games.
That's the Balkans.
That's the Balkans.
Organized crime is another topic you focus on. Do these two overlap? In other words, is the Balkan region the region where organized crime thrive?
Every culture has its organized criminal operation. When you have a culture like the Balkans that collapses into violence and uncertainty as it did in the 1990s. The same is true with Romania and Bulgaria to an extent. Then you see the emergence of organized crime groups as very influential parts of the elite. And once organized crime puts its roots down in a country, it's very difficult to get rid of it. But of course, organized crime is very well known in Italy, and the 'ndrangheta in particular, less so the Sicilian mafia. The most powerful organized crime group in Italy is the 'ndrangheta from Reggio Calabria, from Calabria. And there's also the Camorra as well in Naples, Sacra Corona Unita in Puglia. These groups remain very powerful. We have big organized crime groups in Dublin, in Ireland, Czechoslovakia, and then the Czech Republic and Slovakia was heavily influenced by Russian organized crime in the beginning, and they are still present here in different forms, not as obvious as they used to be. So the problem with I wrote my book McMafia, which was about the emergence of organized crime in the 90s and the 2000s. The problem with organized crime is they learnt during this period that the more control and influence you have over political systems, the more money you can make. And what I fear has happened since I wrote McMafia in 2007, 2008, is that more governments, more corrupt politicians have engaged with organized crime, so that you get somebody in the most powerful position in the world, Donald Trump, who has had proven relationships with the New York mafia when he was trying to build his casinos in New Jersey.
If I ask you how organized crime changed during the time you write about it, would you say that perhaps the interference of organized crime and politics is a new and important phenomenon?
I would say that what happened is that organized crime very quickly in the early 1990s ceased to be a family and loyalty-based operation, and it became a transactional operation. So you saw collaboration, say, between the Albanians and the Colombians that had never existed before. You saw collaboration between the Russians and the Afghans and the Tajiks bringing heroin into Europe in a way that you had never seen before. In order to secure their position, they became important parts of the oligarchy that emerged in Russia and in parts of the Balkans and so on. And their political influence remains incredibly important, particularly in those weak areas, say, where you have weak governance, say, for example, West Africa, where a lot of the cocaine trade operates through, and in which political leaders will be involved in that sort of trade. And it globalized. So the key thing about the 1990s is organized criminal operatives observed how borders were opening. They observed how you could get complex supply chains of criminal goods. And you had this huge area for 10 years from Ljubljana to the Chinese border where law and order was not functioning properly. So you had that combination of Western expansion, huge consumer market, and a grey area. And these networks, whether it's in drugs, whether it's in people smuggling, whether it's in the smuggling of arms, consolidated themselves, and they remain there to this day.
Before we finish, I want to mention one hot topic, and that's migration, because it's a topic which can win you elections in many European countries. You spoke a little about people smuggling. is migration the source or the means for organized crime?
So, it's an operation that organized crime is very good at, and along with other sectors, what has happened in the past 15 years is that organized crime has integrated network computers and cyber into their operations. So with GPS, for example, this gives smugglers a huge advantage. But let's have a look at Britain and migration over the past 10 years. 2016, Britain had about 110,000 legal migrants into the United Kingdom. After Brexit, and much of Brexit was about migration, we saw legal migration into the United Kingdom rise at an astonishing rate because we don't have people to do all the jobs that we need them to do. So that in 2023, almost 1 million legal migrants came into the United Kingdom. The number of people who were coming across on boats was about 10 to 15,000. So this is a tiny, tiny percentage. What that percentage does of illegal migrants or asylum seekers who have difficulty getting there is that this actually statistically irrelevant group of people becomes a political tool. And it's a political tool used, I mean, Nigel Farage is a past master at this, for all sorts of other reasons. And so until you get a counter-narrative emerging explaining that Europe's economy cannot survive without large-scale ordered migration, until you are able to explain to people that that's the way the world works right now, then this will always be exploited by the Nigel Farages or the Viktor Orbáns of this world in order to consolidate their political power.
Misha Glenny, thank you very much for coming and talking to us.
Já vám moc děkuji. Já bych měl mluvit česky teda.
Wonderful.
Yeah.